Should we bring shame back into our culture? What are the 7 deadly sins of US software companies? And what are the true costs of Canada's healthcare system? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds to find the most interesting takes, and we talk about them. We either critique them or say what they've done right. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to leave a like and a subscription if you can. Helps us out a ton. You can follow us at Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube, and Good Take Bad Take Pod on Instagram. Without further ado, our first take is a meme from Rothmus, and the meme says the government, and then it's Gandalf. I'm like, I just read these books. Gandalf with his line, "I'm not trying to help you. I'm trying to rob you." All right. And of course, what do you make of this comparison?
This is kind of a shallow but good meme. Like, yeah. I think of this all the time because it's one of the standout scenes he has early on in the movies. Ian McKellen, he's like, "I'm not trying to rob you," and then he's all dark and scary, but "I'm trying to help you." And I think of this all the time, like when I'm trying to do something for someone and I'm trying to actually help them, but they're like, most of the time it's like a little kid, like one of my niece or nephew or something like that. I'm trying to help them open a fruit snack and they think I'm taking it away from them, but I'm actually trying to help them open it. But it is the exact opposite for the government. And we have a take, I think, at the very end of this that talks about healthcare and all of these different types of taxes and programs that they put in place and things that the government says like, "Oh, we're doing this because there's some need that we need to address." They act like that need would never be addressed unless they actually took it upon themselves to help. And their helping is taking away the tools that you have to actually help yourself because they somehow can administer it better. But like we all know, no one likes anything about any government service that they have any daily interaction with. Right? Like, so think about the DMV when you go to get your driver's license. Think about the post office when you go in. Think about any sort of government office where you're standing in a line in some awful building and have to get something stamped so that you can pay taxes on something that you don't think you should have to pay for. Like, everyone knows and hates any sort of government service they have to interact with directly. Yet somehow when we abstract that service and we make it like healthcare or we make it like the roads or something that's a little bit further away, and we don't have to interact exactly with the people that are administering it right off the bat. Suddenly, it's something that we can't live without. But it's like we prefer the private option in every single instance that we encounter in our daily lives. But for some reason, when it gets to the big, broad, sweeping things, we think, "Oh, we need to have the government." And it turns out that the same principle that governs and makes it awful for you to interact with these services on a day-to-day basis is also the same principle that makes it awful, at the macro level.
So this meme reminds me of another take that I was gonna throw in here, and it works really perfectly. Which is it's an old one, and someone copy and pasted it from someone, so that's why it's resurging here. But it's from Todd Hagopian, who's libertarian in chief on Twitter, and he tweeted, "By the time I'm 67, over $600,000 will be paid into Social Security on my behalf. That money would have been worth $1.9 million if I had gotten a 5% return. My annual interest would be $95,000. The government promises me $3,075 a month at 67, which is $37,000 a year. How is it not theft?"
Yeah.
And that's exactly to illustrate what you're talking about. The government comes and says, "Oh, we're going to help." And of course, it's never voluntary, right? It's all mandatory. You can't choose to opt out of Social Security. They tax you at this, and then they give you bad rates of return that you could have gotten in others. And then, he has a follow-up, which I think is helpful, which is to say, "For people who are calling me stupid because this is an insurance policy, my private disability insurance policy will pay the same $3,000 a month and costs me $2,500 a year. I would have to live to be 798 years old to lose 1.9 million on it." And then there's some more other supplementary tweets as well that further clarifies the distinction here. But yeah, so it's the exact same thing. It's like the illustration I mentioned earlier that I heard where, you send, if you started a school for kids to learn how to walk from the government, in a generation, everyone would think that without the government, no one would be able to walk. And that's exactly what we have with the government in every institution, where they say, "Oh, we're going to provide this great service, and all it ends up doing is rob. And the best intentioned people are being useful idiots to the people who really are behind the scenes, who know that they're not actually providing something of value and are instead trying to rob you. And, whether or not you think people are malicious or, just, sort of doing things the wrong way, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Yeah.
When it comes to what your perspective should be on the policies themselves. How you approach it, maybe that will change. But I think about with Washington State, we have a long-term care program that they voted in that taxes 58 cents off of every $100 that a worker makes, no matter what your income level is, and it pays into this program that's supposed to be for long-term care for you. And they had to delay the program after voting it in by a year, and then there was a short opt-out window for people who already had long-term care insurance. You had over 400,000 people choose to opt out, and then they closed that window tightly. But there's just been problems with this, where it's not about serving the people, because the lifetime benefit is somewhere around $36,500, which is super inadequate for someone's long-term care needs, for the type of person who's actually going to need long-term care and have long-term care needs. You also have issues of the way that the program is designed. You have to pay into it for at least like 10 years or else you don't get it. So there's a lot of people who would pay in for like 9 years, not be able to take out the benefit. You can't, if you moved out of the state, you would no longer qualify for it. So you could pay into it your whole life and then want to retire to somewhere that's not Washington State because of like the tax burden, and you wouldn't get this benefit. So there's just so many examples of, again, whether it's just, inadequate planning or bad math or malintent, the government is actively robbing you and not trying to help you and not trying to do things in a way that are going to be beneficial for you as an individual, but rather things that are beneficial for itself in the short term.
Most people, when they evaluate charities, like the big bad line item in a charity is administrative costs or fundraising costs. And the reason why is because it's like, hey, if you're passing money into a charity, you want to make sure as much of that dollar that you give actually goes to the person or the cause that you're trying to help on. And most people view administrative and fundraising costs as basically like a leech on that dollar. It should be as small as possible. And in the private charity world, around 30%, in the worst case scenario, that's kind of like the bare bones standard. 30% of fundraising, or 30% of funds given to a charity should go to administrative and fundraising costs. Ideally, it's much less than that. 70 to the actual service, and then 30 to the people that run it. In the government, it's flipped upside down, right? Like it's 30% actually gets to the person that it's supposed to help, and then 70% is spent on administrative costs. And for some reason, we understand why that is really bad in a private charity's case, because it's like, wow, it's inefficient, it's bad, it's losing money. It would have been better just to give directly to the person. But once we see it being done, on the government level, we make some sort of exception. It's just like, well, that's just the government inefficiency. It's like, well, let's just not pass any funds through that inefficient system in the first place, and we'll all be better off.
And again, if there's a charitable cause you like, and there's a charitable organization that addresses that cause, and it is inefficient, but you think it's important enough to pass your money, you're free to do that. The difference, of course, here is with governments, you don't have the choice, right? You don't, you can justify all the reasons why something is or isn't important or needs a certain split, but at the end of the day, the major difference with charities is that you have control over that, and there's actually a market response. So if there is a charity that needs an exorbitant amount of administration costs to address a specific need, then people who want to donate to that can go to them and say, hey, why are your administrative costs so high? And they can explain, well, this is a particularly expensive thing to do,
exactly,
and it requires careful oversight. And then people can say, okay, I can see you're using the money responsibly, even if
continue to give you money.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to continue to support this, versus, an organization that is just being negligent, at which point, assuming their own board isn't, holding them to account, because that's also often the case in these nonprofits, is that you have people who are interchangeable and accountable. And so the board will hold them accountable, but then donors themselves will hold them accountable if the board won't. So there's a whole many layers of this that the government does not have, because it's all mandatory and it's all monopoly. Okay, our next take comes from Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who posts, "Beauty shames the ugly. Strength shames the weak. Death shames the living, and the ideal shames us all. A little bit of a different take from our government meme there.
Yes. Yeah, this is a little bit more big picture of life sort of stuff. Man, I really liked this one. And I hope as a Christian that Dr. Jordan B. Peterson comes to know the Lord, because I think that ideal that shames us all, like, is the first step to understanding like your need for Jesus Christ. And so this is like such a great take in so many different ways. And I think that one of the core failures of our society in the past 50, 60 years is that it used to be, and this might have been a necessity for survival, that like if something was ugly, you had to rise to the occasion to make it beautiful. If you were weak and the weakness was a detriment to your ability to exist, like you had to rise to the strength level to continue going on. And it used to be that a standard called us to something higher, and that a lot of people would try and reach for it, and then they would exceed it. And that was awesome. But today the script is kind of flipped. It's like the existence of any standard, if it makes you feel bad about yourself, then we should get rid of it, and therefore it's bad. And that just makes for weak people. It makes for, I can't remember who said it, but I remember reading it in actually one of Dr. Peterson's books. But like, if you're scared of what strong men can do, just wait for what weak people can do. And, and what weak people are capable of, because they will do things that are not sustainable. And strong people will do stuff like that too, but at least there's strength behind it, and that there's something good could potentially come of it. Weak people are in a perpetual spiral going downwards, and they want to continue to live within that weakness and within that badness and within, that action and those activities that bring them shame. And they're constantly trying to avoid it. And I think that like, there's such an like, we don't want to feel shame. We don't want to feel guilt. But it's like, that's sometimes a good signal that maybe what you're doing isn't something you should continue doing. Maybe you need to hop out of that. And one of the things that really annoys me about, like therapy, like the modern day therapy scene, is a lot of it is based in, like, oh, well, you making yourself feel better, as opposed to like actually fixing the problem. And, I had a really close friend of mine who struggled with alcoholism. And I remember going to a therapy session with him, and, just talking with this therapist, and this therapist was scolding me for being grumpy at my friend for making these decisions and literally being found in a ditch. And, after having drank a bunch of liquor and taking a bunch of pills, it's like, I don't think the shame at this moment is necessarily the most dangerous part of what's going on here. I think that there's like a behavior change that this person needs to, change, or else it's going to destroy them. And this therapist was not, really game to do that. They were more about, I don't know, whatever this person's mental health is, and not in the way that's like, it's kind of like, it's like, well, you're becoming, unhealthy, and you've got really high cholesterol, and you're feeling bad about it. So just go ahead and go eat more chocolate. Like, it's not really a solution. It's just, it makes you feel better, but it doesn't actually make reality better. So I really like this take by Dr. Peterson. Most of his takes are pretty good. So
yeah. I think the shame point you bring up is critical, because we as a culture have, I think, overcorrected and overcompensated, because and this is just, I think, probably human nature and bound to be the reality of every generation that grows up. Having a generation that has their own world they grew up with, which was raised by a generation that had their own world that they grew up with. And to the point where, there were probably a good number of abuses not abuses in like abusive situation, although they did exist, but with, shaming kids for certain things that maybe they came down too hard on and did end up damaging kids, and that affected how they raised their kids. And then there's been this overcorrection to the idea that shame itself is in fact bad. And I think that's the wrong approach. It's like, shame is a tool like any other kind of tool. It can be abused and can be misused, absolutely. But like you've said, we've run from shame in and of itself. It's kind of like the idea of offense, right? Like, people will say, "Oh, I'm offended," as if that's the end of the conversation. And it's like, well, so what? There's got to be more than just being offended, or oh, he shamed me. Okay, but what were you? Was it in service of a good thing, or was it being shamed over something that you ought not to be ashamed over? There's a difference, and you have to teach wisdom to discern those things. It's not just a matter of shaming someone is bad. It's shaming someone over something that ought not be shamed is bad. And then, well, how do you figure that out? Well, that's where wisdom comes in. That's where you have to have cultural values of norm. And that's where you need to find what beauty is. And so that's why we've developed these things. In fact, the very mechanism for discerning beauty is shame in some ways. The very mechanism of discerning right from wrong is shame. And yet because we have run away from shame, we now don't even have the ability to distinguish the two. And so the idea of saying, no, you need to use shame to distinguish them is to say, well, we don't even know what those things are because we don't have the shame mechanism, which has weighed this out. It's kind of where the sort of tongue-in-cheek phrase that gets thrown around by people, which is like, we need to bring back bullying. That's where this comes from, because people will come out, and obviously that's a little bit hyperbolic, but the emphasis is the same, right? It's a mechanism by which we create standards in society, and I think that is the ultimate point being driven here, which is to say, in order to have, well, maybe this isn't the point he's making, but it's a very strong takeaway, which is, in order to have standards that exist, you have to have a mechanism by which you distinguish those standards. And in many cases, that is shame, to be able to separate the right from the wrong. And I think he illustrates that in this take here.
Yeah, his last line, that the ideal shames us all, like, that really is, if you really think about the person that you could be and the virtues that you should have be part of your life, and then you measure yourself against how you live those out day to day or where you fall short, like, it really does, it can feel really crushing. And I think that from a Christian perspective, it will crush you, and then you need to choose something that is beyond yourself, and that redemption that can bring you there. I think from like a less like spiritual side of things, like I feel better about my life and this ideal that I never will reach and never live up to. Like, obviously, one, through my Christian faith, but then two, also from the thought that, like, hey, like, I am becoming now that ideal. Like, I can now make a choice every single day that is what I'm going to aim at. And one of the really scary things about like our modern day, culture and people that are saying different things about this stuff is that it's no longer even that we're trying to aim at it and missing, because we all do miss that ideal. It's that we've totally just decided that target is not worth aiming at. And when we're stopped aiming at the target, and that means we're aiming at something else. And I think we can see the result of, like, just from a utilitarian standpoint, like, look at the result of whatever we have chosen as opposed to the ideal, and it's quite frightening and sad and destructive and ugly. Like, it's such a like offensive thing these days to call something ugly, but it used to be like obvious to folks whether something was beautiful or ugly. We used to be able to agree on that, but now, because we've moved the target, we don't want to aim at the same target. People can't even agree upon those types of things.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say there is that being able to call these things out, it's helpful to creating a society that learns and grows. Otherwise, you really end up with sort of a lost generation that doesn't feel like there is a root identity or a goal to work towards. Because when you don't have standards, when you don't call things out, you end up saying everything's okay, all is good, and then people kind of go into a nihilistic fog. Really,
yes.
I think their ideal is almost a hedonistic fog. But even that, hedonism really leads to nihilism, because hedonism is I think it doesn't sit well with most people. Even if they like the idea of it for a while, they realize, oh wait, if things are hedonistic, then doing the most sick acts, if it's for my own pleasure, actually is okay. And so I think that there's just a moral incongruity that most people feel with that. And so then your hedonism turns into nihilism. And even if you don't believe in the higher powers that I think are very real, and you ought to, just from a macro level, you should realize that's not a culture or a society you want to live in. You don't want to live in a world with a bunch of nihilistic people.
Yeah.
Okay, our next take, this one's a little bit more a little bit more, I don't know what to say here, like creative, I guess. This is an article that reads, "The 7 Deadly Sins of U.S. and non-U.S. Software Companies Under U.S. Export Controls and Sanctions Laws." And then we have 4 of them listed here. Number 1, pride. Arrogantly assuming that your software is not regulated by U.S. law. Number 2, wrath. allowing the complexity of U.S. export control regulations to anger you to the point of neglecting a thorough compliance analysis. Number 4, lust. Providing a SaaS, software as a service, offering, parentheses, because it's the sexy new thing to do, without considering U.S. export control and sanctions laws. 5, gluttony. Failing to screen customers against the sanctioned countries and denied parties lists because of a hunger for any and all customers. Okay, let's talk about this.
Yeah. So, and just to add to the article's flavor, they have like the news article or newspaper like clippings of each letter laid out like a serial killer. So if you don't, the implication being that if you don't adhere to U.S. export and sanctions laws, you're as bad as a serial killer from like Seven or whatever. So I worked in software, and I've created several software products, and then I've worked at several companies with software products. And back in November of 2023, several new laws came down that muddy the waters, at least, on what kind of compliance is required for a bunch of different countries. And these are several countries in Africa. There are some countries in Eastern Europe. There are countries in the Middle East, countries that are very prosperous and that want to buy software but can't, basically, because the U.S. is saying like, hey, anytime you sell to them, you've got to get a written statement of use from whatever that customer is, telling what they're intending to use this software for. And so the thing about a software as a service, imagine, it's the same as like Netflix. Imagine every single month that you wanted to use Netflix, you had to fill out a form that said what you intended to use Netflix for. And then it had to get approved by some corporate, lawyer somewhere, and you couldn't use the service until it was, and it had to be done every single month. Like, it would quickly make Netflix an untenable business. Like, they would just say, hey, we're not going to sell to this country anymore because it's too much of a burden. Netflix is a cheap service. It's $10 a month. If you're going to have to have a corporate lawyer on staff review every single one of these statements of use that comes through, suddenly we're just going to block those countries because it's not worth it anymore. And so, these people, just like we were talking about earlier with like the government trying to quote unquote help, it's like, oh, we're trying to keep everything safe. We're trying to help the little guy. But it's like, all you're basically doing is just punishing the people that want to use basic services someplace else. The thing that will really enrage you is if you go look at the Export and Compliance website, they have specific cutout exemptions for certain types of weapons manufacturers if you're trying to sell to these countries. So it's not actually we need to keep national security safe or whatever. There's literally an exception in it for selling certain types of missile software and technology, design technology, which is just crazy. It's like, so I can't sell, this platform that I'm building for like finding stuff on Craigslist. I can't sell that to someone in Turkey, but the U.S. government, or not the U.S. government, but like Lockheed and Martin could sell some sort of missile technology to them. And it's, my thing is dangerous and theirs is not. And so it makes you realize that it's like, oh no, this is not a matter of like objective safety. It's not a matter of like, oh, we're trying to have some sort of national security goal. It's really just we want to punish certain types of parties in some way, and there's motivations that we don't know about, but that really benefit the people that make these decisions in place. And it's not to ours or the people on the other side of the world's benefit to adhere to them. So this article really irritated me because it's so like, it just talks down like that. Like there's like government is God to this person, that like, oh, well, the U.S. law can do no wrong. And so if you want to not have to adhere to it, and you want to sell your innocent software, because it is innocent, most software is innocent, to someone in some other country that willingly wants to buy it and use it for an innocent purpose, like how arrogant of you, how awful and gluttonous of you to want to sell your product to as many customers as you possibly can, as if like the U.S. government is not guilty of every single one of these and more sins. Like it irritated me so much when I read this article.
It sounds a lot like you are suffering from pride and wrath, dude.
Yeah, I am. I've definitely fallen into the wrath campaign. They knew how I would feel as I read this.
You might need to go to a priest and confess. Maybe Joe Biden oh wait, no, he's not allowed in Catholic churches. Never mind. The thing that makes me laugh about this in particular is it makes me think of a quote from Mark Zuckerberg when this was years ago when the Social Network movie came out. And he was sort of humorously recounting the differences between the real life events and the narrative depicted in the film. and he pointed out, he's like, it was weird because, you know, they would get some details absolutely correct. Like every single one of the flannels that he wore, I own. It's in my closet. You know,
that's crazy.
He's laughing. He was laughing about that, and then he's like, but you know, they start the movie out with him wanting to build this social network site about rating girls as revenge for getting dumped by this girl, and he's like, no, I've been dumped before, but I was dating the same girl before I started Facebook, who's now my wife. So that was clearly not it. And the key quote here comes in when he says, it's funny because I think that they just don't understand the idea that sometimes people just want to build things to build things. And I mean, wow. I might be paraphrasing that a little bit, right? But he's like, they just don't understand this mindset that like sometimes you want to build something to see something cool built. And I that sort of mentality makes me think of this, where it's like, you know, especially when it comes to the gluttony one, where it's like, you know, oh, you a hunger for any and all customers, and like you're just trying to absorb those. It's like they can't fathom the idea that maybe you just want to provide a cool service and you want to be able to expand that and build it out and offer it to as many people as you can. Is there a profit motive? Absolutely. But you wouldn't build something if there wasn't a problem being solved that or a service being offered to begin with. And so this idea that it's like, oh, the only reason why you wouldn't check the compliance laws is because you're so arrogant to think that you're bypass it, because you're gluttonous for all these customers, because you have like I don't know, it's you're in the wrong and you're wrathful. It's just like a total mind shift of how they perceive entrepreneurs and business owners in general. When you know, sure, at the very, very top, maybe there are some people who are totally bought in this way. I'm not saying they're not. There are lots of corporate CEOs who I think are probably very unhealthy people, but the vast majority of businesses and business owners are not these mega conglomerates, and they're the ones that are falling under these. Like the even having to point out that it would be quote unquote arrogant to assume that your software is not regulated by US law is to tacitly admit that the company is probably of a size where they might think that they're not actually, you know, affected by this law, because these mega conglomerate corporations clearly would have a compliance section for this kind of thing. So even in this, you're admitting that a lot of the people you're talking to here are smaller operations and a lot more regular people who are just providing good business offerings. So the whole perspective and sort of condescension and sneering that this entails, again, I get that it would be for a theme, and that the writer probably is making a few stretches here in order to make it fit with this theme, but I wouldn't feel comfortable writing this even if it was, you know, in order to fit a theme. I like my perspective to at least be somewhat aligned with the truth and the majority of people when I'm speaking out. So I don't know. This seems like a lot of bitter projection based on the person.
It's written by a lawyer in DC. So yeah, there you go.
If you live in DC, I'm already like less likely to think that your opinion is going to be aligned with the rest of the world. I'm sorry. There's just like an air over there that hangs, you know, and you're just like, I feel icky.
It's like all of these are bad. These are the four that really stuck out to me. He obviously has 7 because it's the 7 deadly sins on there. And those other ones, he kind of like, they all are stretches, but these ones you could tell he was vested in because there was definitely an element of like vitriol in the way they did it. And I think it's particularly evident in the providing a SaaS offering because it's the sexy new thing to do. It's like, yeah, it's not because it's the sexy new thing to do. It's because it's best for customers that people provide that. Right. Like, we found a model that makes things cheap and affordable and easy to access, as well as providing predictable revenue so that companies can scale. Like, that's an awesome thing. It's not a sexy new thing to do, and everyone's just hopping on the bandwagon. It's like if this guy had his own way, it's like we'd be selling stuff the same way that we sold it in the 90s. It's like hop in a time machine and go back there and do that. But it's like, you know, for all these folks that want to have regulation and they prop it up as like the main way to progress society, like it seems like most of their things are actually limiting the people that are progressing society from doing what they need to do and getting technology that does progress society into the hands of others that also want to do it. So yeah, this type of like elitism from someone who makes their money off of having bunches of rules and making it so complicated that the normal person can't understand, it was just really angered me, especially because like personally in my life, like I'm trying to like build things that I can give to people, not give, but sell to people and exchange with people that makes their lives better. And it's like, oh, well, you can't do that. You're going to spend most of your time addressing all this red tape. It's just rather unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, the next take here has had a little bit of controversy in libertarian online circles. This one reads, if your life is made miserable because someone is outside, not on your property, doing something you don't like, maybe get a freaking hobby. All right, what do you make of that?
Yeah, so this is kind of around the whole discussion on homelessness. I think you and I, living in Washington State and within 50 miles of Seattle, have a unique insight into what it means to not deal with the homeless on the streets. And we have a mutual acquaintance, I should say, from the university we went to. This is a female and very, very liberal when she was at school, and very much, was kind of like irritated at anyone that said like, hey, we shouldn't let homeless people, use the bathroom on the street and leave needles all over the place, and under the guise of being, kind of a bleeding heart. And what's really funny is that once she got an apartment after she graduated, and she had to walk past a homeless encampment to get home because the parking lot for it was kind of a little bit of ways away. Suddenly she was saying things like, oh, well, we need to do something about this because I just don't feel safe. Like, you need to feel safe when you're out walking about. It's like, yeah, see, like, it was really easy for you when you lived in Kirkland, the nice, utopian place that does enforce all of these homeless laws in a lot of ways. Maybe it doesn't anymore, but back then it did, to say these things. But once you had to actually experience it for yourself because you were living in Seattle, suddenly it became very real to you. And so, it's not like, oh, just go get a hobby. It's like, no, like in Seattle, like there are people that have been assaulted in very, very awful ways because there is no actual like law being upheld in terms of like property rights. And like you and I, as libertarians, this is like, people think this is kind of a gotcha moment because like, well, you don't believe in the government or you don't really like police or anything like this. But it's like, well, we believe in private property. And we believe in property rights, and we believe in non-aggression principle. And so when I talk to a property manager in Seattle and they say, hey, we tell all of our property managers, if we see a homeless person sleeping in our doorway on our property, don't go talk to them, because if they start beating you up, like that, or sorry, if they don't, unless they start threatening your life with like a gun or a knife, they could beat you up and the police could watch it happen and not do anything about it. The police literally told us, unless they actually pull a knife or a lethal weapon on you, like, we're not going to get involved. Like, that's not the enforcement of property rights. That is not the enforcement of non-aggression. It does not line up with libertarian principles. And we believe that if you have private property and someone is doing something on that property that you don't like, you should have the right to remove them. And then you might say, it's like, well, this is not on your property, but it's like, well, we all live in this area and it's public property. We don't believe in public property, but if it's public property and we've paid for it, that means we have a say in it. And the people that pay for that should have more of a say than the people that don't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The other thing to me is that, if you were to take this apart from context, like there is some truth to it. Like, if you're just thinking about things that aren't affecting your life, then that's one thing. But one, it is not unreasonable to say that there ought to be a certain way things are, even if you are not directly mandating people live that way. For instance, I think it is better for the culture that I live in to be surrounded with people who share my values. That doesn't mean I'm going to go to them by gunpoint, but it does mean that I would peacefully try to convince them of some viewpoints or get them to agree. So if I live next to a socialist, even if they're not doing anything that's directly affecting my life with it, in at least ostensibly, like physically, their votes might be, it is still, to be made miserable might be going stretch, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say I can yearn to want to change their mind. Even if they're living their life over there and I'm living mine, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, I think it is, I would like it better if the people next door lived to me shared my worldview and values. I don't think that's unreasonable because it does impact your life. And I think that's the other misnomer, is that the idea of, oh, if it's not on your property, then it doesn't affect you at all, is to say, well, no, like, it means you don't have a right to go over and stop them with force, but it does affect you, how people do things and how they live. If your neighbor is smoking all day weed, let's even get the smell thing out aside, let's just assume for the sake of argument that he's just stoned out all the time. That does affect your life. Even if I don't think it should be stopped by force. It means that your neighbor's probably less likely to be proactive in cleaning and maintaining their house. They're probably less proactive about, keeping the value up and making the area surrounding it nice. It probably means that they're less likely to be outside being sociable in certain ways with you. So there are impacts, whether or not you would think they're important. The point is that, like, your personal concerns, again, not influenced by force, it's not are irrational or unreasonable to have preferences about how other people live. To the point of force, no. But I think that this kind of gets conflated with the idea that, like, oh, either you think everything that you believe should be imposed with force, or you have no preferences at all and you have no thoughts on how to live. And I think that's a false choice.
Yeah. What's funny is that, like, people that think this way, it's like, okay, well then just move. And it's like, okay, the net taxpayers are moving, and when the net taxpayers do move, then there's a shortfall in the budget. Certain services can't be funded, and they say, oh, well, the reason it's so bad is because we weren't able to get this levy through to make this, this homeless thing or whatever program get put up. We need to raise more money and tax more people. And, like, it's these people's fault for, reverse gentrification, moving out of the city and stuff like that. It's like, man, you can't have it both ways, right? Like, either people, like, yeah, it's not my problem what you do on your property. If you want to move, then just move. But it's like, but then you still make it all the people's existing problems there, and then you blame the people that moved. Like, it's like their fault that the thing is awful there. It's like, at some point you got to make things beautiful. Like Jordan Peterson was saying, beauty and ugly are at odds. And if you decide that you're going to just say that everything is beautiful, then suddenly you're paralyzed. You can't actually make any sorts of decisions. You can't actually enforce any sort of standard. And like you're saying, having a preference for a standard, and then having the people that are able to, the people that are not net benefiting, but net paying into making sure that happens, they should have more of a say than someone who doesn't. And what's funny is our entire society is kind of like upside down in that way. The people that are not net benefiting this system, they are the ones that have the least. They have the most amount of say, and the people that are benefiting it are the ones that have the least. So it's not sustainable, and that's why these cities are in such a downward crazy spiral. Like, I don't know if you've been to. I think you have been to Seattle a bit as of late because you had to commute for work. But, like, I remember going down there, like, one night. It's like, man, I went to Ballard to see a buddy of mine. It's like, this freaking certain parts of this look like Gotham City. Like, this is, like, not awesome. I do not like being here, and I would feel awful about paying $6,000 a month for an apartment. To walk out and feel like I'm going to get destroyed by some person that's tweaking on something. So, I would not want to live there. Like, and that's why people are moving.
Exactly. And it's embarrassing when, like, someone will fly in. I just did an airport pickup for a friend and dropped them off in a hotel in Seattle for work. And, it was a friend of my wife's, and my wife was saying, like, okay, well, we're going to drop you off at the hotel. It's like a super, super short commute from the hotel that she's staying at to the office building that she goes into. But Alexa's like, yeah, just make sure you don't go too late at night. Cause it's, and it's like, it's just so, just thinking about having to say that for the distance that it was just made me shake my head, because I'm like, she's right, Yeah. And I mean, even recently when I went to Robbie the Fire Bernstein's comedy show, like, sometime last year with my friend, shout out, maybe it was a little over a year. Anyway, I'm walking through Seattle, and it was at night. It's two guys, so we're not as worried, but it's still like you're walking through, and it just smelled like urine.
Yeah.
Going through a certain section, you're just like, this is lame. Like, this city used to be so cool, and now it's just not.
Yeah.
All of the sort of countercultural revolution that Seattle tries to be, and now it's like, okay, you've devolved into smelling like pee.
Yeah.
Very cool, guys. So yeah, no, that's really the thing that this kind of take ignores, is just decay isn't isolated. Even a friend who is in a place of decay emotionally and in their personal life, sometimes they will spiral down, but, like, that impacts your friends too, that you can bring them down with you, or that you can cause them to grieve with loss because you've devolved so much. So while I do believe that individuals have, autonomy over themselves, and you can't impose things, there is no such thing in a social reality that we live in as total individual isolation and like impactless living, unless you live in the middle of nowhere where you interact with nobody. Even then, you can argue that your impacts change the ecology around, which can impact future people or people even in the nearby area. But I think that there's this angsty idea that, you know, how people live never affects anyone else. And that's not the case. It doesn't mean I'm not libertarian or that I think that libertarian principles aren't right, but I think it means you need to be more realistic in how you perceive your actions and how they impact others and how other people do affect your life, and why it's important to promote good living and good lifestyles and healthy attitudes towards your own welfare and your property's welfare and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our last take here is a little bit longer. It's a tweet thread talking about Canada's healthcare system. So let's dive in. So the first tweet I'm just going to read it all kind of as one here. So, okay, so it starts. Big issue with Canada's healthcare is it can work, but we knew we had an aging population. But governments, instead of taking money from the boomer population to prepare it for their old age, let it explode, and my generation has to pay for 50 years of negligence. A few dollars from their paychecks over 50 years would have made far more sense than us choosing to forego medical services or going to the US's emergency rooms because we have a higher chance of dying while waiting than to be seen by a doctor. The worst part is, I'm very aware that for a lot of illnesses, time is of the essence. My brother might have lived if doctors had been able to detect his tumor earlier. Yes, his syndrome made it difficult, but he was essentially done for the moment a doctor finally saw him. A part of me was mad that they didn't try and figure things out and just gave him vitamins. And the thing is, this was before the pandemic, when the whole system exploded. The earlier you find illnesses, the higher your odds. You shouldn't have to wait a year to get treated for an ailment that's likely to kill you in 3 to 6 months. What's the point in seeing a doctor if you're at the terminal phase? I'm not blaming doctors themselves, but we had 50 plus years to plan for it. I feel like I like free healthcare as much as the next guy, but it's pathetic now. Okay, what do you make of this take?
Are you familiar with like the Scorpion and the Frog story?
Maybe, but not by that name.
Okay, so this is a story that one of my old bosses told me. It's about human nature. So basically, like, there's a scorpion and a frog, and they're on one side of a river. And the scorpion's like, "Hey, frog, like, I can't get across this river because I can't swim, but you kind of can. Can I hop on your back and you take me across?" And the frog's like, "No, dude, like, you're gonna sting me. Like, you're a scorpion. Like, duh." And the scorpion's like, "No, I'm not gonna sting you. I promise." And they go back and forth for a little bit, and the frog keeps saying the same thing, and the scorpion keeps saying the same thing. And eventually the scorpion convinces the frog to take him across. And they get to the middle of the river, and the scorpion stings the frog. And the frog's like, "Dude, what the heck? Like, you said you wouldn't. Now we're both going to die because I'm paralyzed and we're both going to drown." And the scorpion's like, "Yeah, I stung you. Like, I'm a scorpion. What did you expect?" And it's basically illustrating the point that, like, hey, like, there are some things that are just inerrant to certain types of organizations or systems or thought processes or motives. And like this person saying the big issue with Canada's healthcare system is it can work. It's like, well, no, but it doesn't work, right? Like it works in some like hypothetical, like, oh, I dreamed it up way, but now look at it in practice, in reality. And the reality is that everything that we predicted and everyone said about free markets, when you align the incentives to be in such a way that anyone can use the service at any time, it means that the service is going to be used inefficiently. There's going to be a free rider problem, and there's a complete moral hazard, as we call it in economics. And when that happens, services either get way more expensive, they get rationed, or they get it. Or I guess those are the two, right? Like you either have to have less of the service, you either have to have it be way more expensive, or it has to be less quality. And what sucks is in a socialist healthcare system, like, yeah, it's quote unquote free, but what good is a free service if you can't use it and if it's terrible in the first place? Like this guy's really sad story about his brother. It's like, yeah, like if you go look at the Vancouver like healthcare system, like one of the procedures that my dad, it was a life-saving treatment that he had done on him. If he wanted to have it done in Canada, if he was a Canadian citizen, it would have taken a year and a half for him to get that treatment done. My dad's alive because he was able to get in within 3 months of him being diagnosed with this issue and getting it fixed. And yeah, it cost quite a bit of money, but my dad had prepared for it with insurance. So we were all okay and all good and all that. So it's almost like the healthcare system in a free system. It does not actually it does not actually have the ability to plan for the future because the incentives are not lined up.
Yeah, so I was going to say that the sort of can work model is the exact justification that people always use for Keynesian economics,
Yeah.
and it's this hypothetical where the people in control, the government in most cases, will know when the right time to make the right move is, and it's so different. It'd be like, for instance, telling someone who doesn't know a song, hey, you need to play this part on guitar. Trust me, you'll know when the timing is to come in. And then saying, well, they can listen to the beats. They'll know when to come in. But if they've never heard the song before, which, with life, we haven't lived the future before. And if you're like, I'm not going to know. I can try my best. Whether it works will matter or not. And you'd be like, what are you talking about, man? I'm looking at the sheet music here and I charted it all out. You'll come in here. It'll be great. I can do this when I write it down. How come you can't do it when you're live performing? And so, with Keynesian economics, it's when you stop stimulating, when you start going into, stop printing the money. And with the healthcare system, it's like, when do you start taxing the population in the right amounts? And even with, the United States, the Social Security system, for us, we had an incredible founding of it. But of course, we were irresponsible with money. We didn't put it away. We didn't save it. And the population demographics have changed dramatically. There's been a lot of reduction in the amount of kids that people are having these days. So there's a number of factors that you just can't predict. And then, of course, with the Social Security example, it belies your point about the scorpion and the frog, where, we had savings from Social Security, and then Clinton decided to use it to pay off other debts, transfer it out, and so that he could say, "Oh, look, we've got we made money. We're not in debt. We don't have a deficit for the first time, or we don't have a deficit for the first time. I think we were still in debt. We're in the black because of me, and it's because he took these Social Security savings and distributed them. So it's one of those things where, yeah, hypothetically, maybe there is a way where you can mathematically work it out where the taxation and the government incentives are correctly lined up, but there will never be a situation where the people who are in power are going to do the right thing over taking the shortcut. That's just not how these systems work. So that was the first thing that came to mind. And then the other two things is, one, he probably has a much closer knowledge of Canada's system, but this is also the case going on in England. You look at the stats of what's happening in England and the average wait times and the average care distribution, and it's crazy over there. There was actually a recent op-ed in the Seattle Times, of all places, talking about King Charles's cancer. And the whole point of the op-ed was King Charles was able to catch his cancer early, but most English citizens aren't that lucky, and they have these wait times. And that leads me, of course, to the last point, which is the idea of free healthcare is just such a misnomer as well, because free implies that there is no cost. And the way that people perceive free, they mean, oh, it does not cost me dollars. But dollars are just another way to measure value. And you know what else is valuable is time. And so when you say it is free healthcare, that's not true, because it just costs you in time. And of course, it also costs you in dollars to run the system and in labor and work. But beyond that point, the more salient point for this is that time is a resource, and it costs you a lot more. Now, the US's system is not great. There are a lot of wait times here that there shouldn't be, but it's not to the point where the other ones are, where the only reliance is on sort of the socialized area. And so you end up paying less of the resource of time and more of the resource of dollars. So it's not a great system. There's a lot of corruption in there with the insurance industries tied to your work, and let's make it free market. I get all that. But relative to where the fully socialized systems are now, the trade-off you have between the two is, one takes a combination of dollar value and of time value, and it's a lot less of the time value and a lot more of the dollar value. And the free, quote-unquote, healthcare systems are basically almost all time value. But of course, in the healthcare industry, that is all the more problematic and dysfunctional because of the urgent nature of so many healthcare concerns. It'd be one thing if you're talking about everyone gets free VR headsets and you just have to be on a wait list, right? And it's like, yeah, that still sucks because, in 2 years, there might be a better headset out. And so the technology, by the time I get this new one, or the one I've signed up for, is already outdated. But that's one thing. That's like, okay, my entertainment value there, or maybe even my productivity value if you're using it for productive reasons. But this is a literal life and death situation for many, or at least massive quality of life enhancement or the enhancement. So I think one of the things that people generally for free market healthcare need to point out is that free healthcare isn't free, and you don't just need to do it in sort of and not that this is wrong, but I think that the sort of the older approach is to say it's not free, someone's paying for it, and then the quick rejoinder is, okay, we'll just make the rich pay for it. And then you have to go into the whole breakdown of how that's not helpful and how that actually hurts. That's fine, but in the shorter term, you need to recognize no, free healthcare is not free for many reasons, but most of which is that it's not free on your time resource, and time is just as much a valuable currency as dollars are, if not more.
Yeah, eventually things, like any sort of service, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And the only way to make the trade-offs less painful is to make the service or the product more efficient. And the only way for some things to be more efficient, at least within like a context like this, is to make sure that only the people that really do need to use it are using it. And then the people who are providing it are able to provide it at a better, at better rates and at more efficiency. And so when you look at services like LASIK surgery and various other things that have been deregulated, that market providers have been able to do it without any sort of burden of regulation, those services have gotten cheaper, they've gotten faster, they've become more available. But when you impose all of this different regulation, just like we're talking about the export and compliance stuff, like suddenly now it's like it's hard. You've tied the hands of the people that are best poised to solve this problem and make it as least painful as possible, and as well as making it not very painful for the people that are using the service in a way that is not efficient. So like prices are a signal. They help ensure that resources and services are distributed in the most efficient manner. And when you distort those prices, you make it so that, not only is the people that should use it are not able to use it as quickly, but the people that shouldn't be using it are using too much of it as well when they shouldn't be. And it just makes it a downward spiral.
Yeah, the other thing, the last thing probably I'll say, and you can chime in if you have any more after this, but he talks about, a part of me was mad that they didn't try and figure things out and just gave him vitamins. This was even before the pandemic. And it's one of those things where I sympathize on the one hand, because I'm like, yeah, I wish that we had more things. For instance, I wish our FDA allowed people who were deemed terminally, diagnosed with cancer or something like that to try experimental treatments. And currently we don't allow them, right? And so in some degrees that gives a level of autonomy to the cancer patient to say, I want to choose this. We should just try things, try to figure this out. But the other thing that sticks out to me is for him and in Canada is it's like, a part of me was mad they didn't try and figure things out. But when you have a system that's already so reliant on the currency of time, you are in deficit of time. And so when you see someone who's terminal, your calculation is, guess what? This guy's probably terminal. And since we have such a long queue of other backed up people, there might be someone who we can save down the line. So we're just going to give you vitamins and get you out of here rather than being able to take the time. As cliched as it is to watch something like the show House, the whole premise of that show is these difficult, weird cases where they take time, even when there's a short time frame, and they try to figure it out, even when it seems impossible. And obviously that's a dramatization, but it's the complete antithesis of this situation where you have a backup of a hopeless number of patients who, some of which are already terminal and some of which could be terminal, but by the time they get to you, definitely will be. And so you don't even have the chance to try to help these people who need it the most. And that's probably the saddest thing about it.
Yeah. I don't have any more on it.
All right. Well, in that case, we will go ahead and call it. Thanks so much for being with us on this episode. As a reminder, make sure to like and share, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.